Good afternoon. It's August the 25th. Uh, Joining us on the call here for a special audio discussion on ESG as a trade barrier in Indonesia is Paul, Bhargav, and Dan, who is currently in Indonesia. At the moment, ESG is the acronym of the day in Indonesian business circles. The push comes from the West, but there have been different layers to this push. I believe you described this as a carrot and stick, Dan.
That's correct.
So could you explain a little bit more about this and what's driving ESG in Indonesia and how this is going to be a trade barrier?
Okay, thanks very much, Uday. The relationship between Indonesia and the West in terms of environmental, social, and governance principles has been a carrot approach up until now, in which the West, represented by the EU and the US, have extended concessionary measures in order to incent the Indonesian government to prevent deforestation, clean up coal plants, and also, to a certain extent, adhere to international labor principles and other emerging international community standards. These carrots were in the form of, for example, the Norwegian government's soft loan in order to protect the forests, in the form of the JTEP, or the Just Energy Transition Program. But those really have not been fruitful, mainly because Indonesia has not wanted to, or has not been able to, comply with the strict technical requirements of the program that require measurement and monitoring and reporting. So the West has, in the last year or so, become quite aggressive toward Indonesia, and I would call this the stick approach. And they have enacted non-tariff trade barriers, I would call them non-tariff trade barriers, to Indonesian products like palm oil and nickel. This is partially, I believe, spurred by the competition between the US and China for the attention of Indonesia. And it manifests itself in several concrete ways I can describe.
All right, Dan, that's interesting. But would you say these frameworks have evolved into trade barriers, especially in the context of EU? And they seem to be targeting specific commodities such as beef, wood, palm oil, coffee, some of the most exported goods out of Indonesia. So would you say it's the new age economic colonization like some are talking about in Indonesia? Paul, I would like your comments on these as well.
Dan, please go first.
Okay, yes, I would say so. I believe that from the standpoint of Indonesia, they've used some of the measures taken by the EU and the US as a form of economic colonialism. And that is reflected in the pushback on the EU proposed regulations on prohibiting imports, especially of palm oil. The restriction on the import of palm oil is tied to progress on preventing deforestation and also loss of habitat in Indonesian forests that tend to be either burned or cut down and then planted by palm oil as a cash crop. The effect of this has bitten into the margins of many palm oil producers, and they put pressure on the government to oppose the EU standards. I talked to one palm oil producer in Kalimantan who told me that in order to export his palm oil, he had to sell it through Malaysia, taking a 50% haircut, and then Malaysia somehow was able to meet the EU standards and was able to onsell it to the EU. Now, this is primarily driven by the fact that there is a delta between prices that will be paid in the West for palm oil and also under other Indonesian products. There's a premium that's paid versus purchases from, let's say, China. So the Chinese pay less, and they also have a smaller market than the EU does. And this is a sanction that bites, and one that has gotten Indonesia's attention, and one that Indonesia intends to appeal and it has been lobbying to the EU to have this regulation change, but it looks like it's going to go forward.
Yeah, and Bhargav, look, coming back to your question, is it in a sense, a trade barrier, though technically it's not? Ultimately, it's a practice that excludes Indonesian products getting into the larger US and market, particularly on motor vehicles. It's also has Indonesia in a bit of a catch-22. Basically, they've got to address their governance issues and decide on whether they are actually going to meet the demands of the US, EU, or lose access to those larger markets and less price-conscious markets. I mean, brief, but Dan said us earlier, pointed out best when he says China pays low prices and its demand is falling with their economy, which has been struggling with years of housing inflation, bad governance, and bad loans. Look, I think Indonesia's in a real crux because, as we discussed on today's earlier recording about 30 Sambo, governance and policing and the implementation is really done so behind a much bigger picture, and that is behind corrupt, powerful officials and the oligopolies that support them and abuse the law for their own favourable outcomes. And that's always about, it's always about wealth. It's not about what's good for the nation. It's not what's good for the country as a whole. It's not what's good to generate tax revenues, develop the country, overcome the disparity between the rich and the poor. There's many components of the machine that is Indonesia's public service, its judicial system, banking system, and they act in cahoots in a very corrupt manner. Personally, I think there's two things to consider. One is it smart policy from the EU and the US? Yes, I think it is. But digging deeper, and it's always the problem. The second issue is, well, how can it be implemented in Indonesia where the oligarchs are prepared to lie, doctor books, change the names of products, their origins, so it will become the wealthy improvising oligarchs that will try to work out ways around these particular bans. They're not going to live with losing 50% of the revenues. They're going to come up with smarter ways to maneuver around these policies. And Dan, frankly, I can see, in theory, the ESG is a clever way to wave a stick, but Indonesia doesn't traditionally give up at that point. It rightfully, as you said, does see this as quasi-colonialism. How hard will it be for them to actually implement this ESG process? I mean, the paper trail can be full, it always has been, by Indonesia. I can't see how they're going to implement this as tightly as they write these policies in capital cities in Europe and DC, mate.
Well, it depends on how you look at, example of implementing sanctions against the Russians. Possibly could apply here. And it's very hard to implement these kinds of tracking things when there is a professional smuggler class. I do think, however, that the way the US, for example, has implemented the tax credit on electric vehicles, which is a very major trade barrier, it has detailed rules for certificates of origin. And unless there is a really sophisticated effort to disguise the origin of certain materials, which would require the collusion of the importers in the US, I think it may be difficult to evade these sanctions. I personally think that ESG is going to be a growth industry in Indonesia, and that these trade barriers, and again, trade barrier is a loaded term that refers to something that is prohibited by the World Trade Organization for countries that ascribe to the various trade treaties. These are more one of the sanctions from the EU is a suit in the World Trade Organization against Indonesia for its downstreaming policy. Another trade barrier, I guess you'd call it, is the availability of the US tax credit. That's really not a trade barrier, but it's an opportunity to make electric cars, or make the components of electric cars competitive. So I don't think that Indonesia is going to resort to, let's say, evading sanctions. I believe that they will try to implement an ESG program, at least the bigger companies will, in order to comply. And I hope that the EU and the US will be reasonable in terms of what the compliance requirements are, because sometimes their requirements are in fact colonial. They're based on American and EU perceptions of what is good and fair, and that may not exactly be how it appears in Indonesia.
Just give us one, for instance, there, could you?
One, for instance?
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest, for instance, is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, it's not a trade barrier; it's a quasi-trade barrier. And what it is, and I am a strident critic of that law, which was passed in 1977 at the urging of Jimmy Carter. It basically imposes a moral requirement on companies to not pay government officials. Now, they call it bribery, and it has major sanctions for it. But as we all know, in Indonesia, there's always some favor that is done for somebody, as long as it's not, often you will do it to express your appreciation for something. Sometimes you will, get into business deals with people who are related to other people. And the U.S. has a absolutely puritanical way of looking at these kinds of relationships that is not culturally appropriate in Indonesia. Now, some things, it's like the Supreme Court, I forget which justice it was, I think it was Potter Stewart. He said, I don't know what the definition of pornography is, but I know it when I see it. I think the same thing goes for corruption. The U.S. has a puritanical view of it, and Indonesia has a more relaxed view of it. And there needs to be a coming together of that, because of the puritanical code in the U.S., Western companies cannot do business in Indonesia. So that's an example.
Then it is interesting that you mentioned how the view is mainly puritanical from an American perspective. Do you think going further, ESG framework will be weaponized? And where does Indonesia stand in the future, especially in the short to mid-term? Will they be able to comply given their, if I may say, addiction to certain practices which may not be seen in generous way in the West?
Well, I think weaponized is a good term, because at least one part of the U.S. tax credit is weaponized. And that is the part that says that if any part of an electric car comes from a company that is controlled by the Chinese government, it invalidates the credit for the entire car. Now, that's definitely a weapon against China, and that is not a trade sanction, because it's not preventing the import of a good or imposing tariffs. It's basically withholding a very important economic benefit if there's any Chinese involvement. So to that extent, I would call it weaponized. There are also, and this is where the U.S. and the EU need to be a little bit careful, the environmental standards in the U.S. are very high, and they're very expensive. And Indonesia just cannot afford some of the, for example, anti-pollution technology. They can't afford to get rid of, two-stroke engines, because poor people use them to get around. And the U.S. has, up until this point, showed a stunning lack of sympathy for Indonesia in its quest to become more environmentally friendly. Now, that having been said, I'm sitting in Jakarta right now, and I can hardly see out my window, because the recently constructed power plants are so polluting that it has given Jakarta the worst air in the world. And this has been going on for 2 weeks, leading to many respiratory illnesses and even deaths in the capital. So, it seems like there are parts of the Indonesian government that want to comply and want to get better, and the U.S. should work with them. And then there are parts of the Indonesian government that actually have regressed and are allowing extremely dirty industries in. So I think it's going to take a steady, sympathetic approach from the Western powers to assist the positive elements in the Indonesian government to achieve these ESG standards.
And Dan, I think there's two issues there to consider. One, really, do we think that they can act in a manner in the West that has cultural sensitivity, flexibility, understands the complexities of what other countries are dealing with? And secondly, with a mindset in Indonesia that when you totally screw up one city, you pick another island at random with land owned by family of future president and say, let's just change the capital city. I mean, that's a magician's way of dealing with the problem of having the world's most polluted city. Just move your capital city. I mean, I can't see flexibility and agility and commitment at either end that is going to see a comfortable path forward. Am I being too downbeat on this?
Well, I can definitely, I mean, the reason that the infrastructure president, Jokowi, turned to China for financing is because the West would not finance infrastructure projects. And they insisted on financing ESG type projects. And Jokowi quite rightly said, you can't drive on or eat ESG. And I need bridges, and I need toll roads, and I need trains, and I need power, and I need all this stuff. And China is willing to lend me money under the Belt and Road to get that done. The West fumbled that ball. And again, just like their puritanical application of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because they weren't sympathetic with the material needs of Indonesia, they are not here. And I believe that this will change in the future because the effects of untrammeled industrial development without basic environmental, social, and labor protections is starting to become evident, and people are starting to talk about it and complain about it. So I think the pendulum will swing back, but hopefully when it swings back, the West will meet Indonesia in the middle and not put on its get on its high horse and dictate to Indonesians who really resent that. That is a colonial attitude that infuriates them. And in fact, you may have seen that Jokowi was just at the BRICS meeting. He is really pushing a non-aligned policy because he may not see any efforts in the West to meet him halfway.
Yeah, and look, there's a real concern from my end that we're going to see a replication of only the Big Four can do the ESG audits. By engaging a Big Four company, it also simplifies the procurement processes on the fundamental belief in America that the Big Four can do anything. And I'm concerned that they're going to put this ESG down and make it even less agile and utilising the Big Four to do all these audits. The people that understand Indonesia in great depth aren't on a trajectory of a career from the West, living in Indonesia, monitoring all these complexities of cultural law, politics that we talk about. Do you think that's a valid concern? Because I just can't see that there's any pathway that allows the smaller companies that really understand ESG and its applications and its implementation in Indonesia. And let's face it, the Big Four don't have a good track record in Asia. They're even fluffing it right up in Canberra in high-profile cases in Australia where they're abusing their position and they're being led totally by commerce. Do you think there's going to be any flexibility and agility for companies to engage, Indonesian companies to engage ESG auditors and companies that can help them establish, or do you think it's just going to be more colonial, big stick approach, push it down and make sure that there's massive day rates getting fed back to America because America always knows that America's exceptional and it does it all better anywhere, just ask them.
Yeah, well, of course, whenever you want to have a result in Washington, you hire McKinsey to write a report after you've given them the conclusion. However, I believe that because of that type of behavior, the major consulting firms and law firms have completely lost credibility. I believe that regulators in the United States, especially in the Treasury Department, are not going to rely slavishly on opinions of large consulting groups unless they are backed up by facts. Now, the advantage that companies in Indonesia have is they understand the Indonesian market and they understand what's going on, and the big ones really don't. So I believe there is definitely a window here for ESG to spread among indigenous Indonesian type companies that can make representations about the supply chain and about compliance with ESG to regulators such as the Treasury Department in the US, and also to bodies in the EU, for example. So no, I don't share I mean, I think that 10 years ago, I might have said, yeah, it's all greenwashing and all you have to do is get an opinion from a big four accounting firm or McKinsey or a big law firm and you're off to the races. It doesn't matter what you do. I don't think that's the case anymore. I believe that more and more people are observing when there is not material compliance with a rule. For example, labor rules. There is a very naughty smelter in Sulawesi that has had numerous employee injuries and deaths, and that is they could get an opinion from one of the big four accounting firms that everything was fine, but you can read in the paper the protests and the chatter about what they're doing, which would undermine such a report. So there's a mechanism for the truth to come out, and it can't be completely greenwashed by the large organizations that are paid for conclusions and not for analysis.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Dan. I'm going to keep a close eye on this. And Bhargav, we've been toying with the idea of extending our services, particularly on the corruption resiliency for companies to ESG. Maybe take that offline, but any closing questions from yourself?
No, at the moment, Paul. I must say that was a very stimulating conversation, especially with the emerging frameworks such as ESG and the weaponization. Dan, thank you very much for lending us some time and your very important and credible points on ESG. Thank you, Uday and Paul.
Thanks very much. Have a nice day.
Cheers, Dan. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.